Jihagadich, and thank you for your time today coming in to join us. I'm Jay Hodges. I'm a proud friend of Sinn Féin's, and I want to welcome you to today's conversation. 2021 is a special year. It marks the 40th anniversary of the 1981 hunger strikes, where 10 very brave men, including Bobby Sands, gave their life to a cause. In the coming weeks, we're going to be speaking to different people, offering different viewpoints and different understandings and different stories surrounding the 81 hunger strikes. We're going to start today with an incredible opportunity and an incredible special guest, and I'm really excited to be able to jump right in. We're going to start today's conversation off with Mr. Bik McFarlane. Bik, how are you doing?
Jay, great to talk to you. Absolutely brilliant, and I'm really delighted that I've been asked to participate in this anniversary project that you're doing. And all's good here, keeping well, just trying to stay ahead of the posse, as the saying goes, with this COVID. Everybody waiting for an ease off of restrictions, which should come probably towards the summer period or after Easter anyway.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on and have a conversation and to talk. You have this incredible life story that would be a fantastic Martin Scorsese movie if anybody is watching. But I really hope that we can talk about all the things that you have done in your life at a later date. I want to really concentrate on the 81 hunger strikes for this conversation. Before we do that, though, I think people need to know a little bit about you as a person, kind of where you are, where you grew up. Were you raised in an Irish Republican household? What caused you to get involved? Like, kind of set the story and tell us about yourself.
My family background would not be Republican; they would be nationalist, and my parents would have been more into the sport, the music, the culture, as opposed to the politics. They were not specifically politically involved. Although I grew up with some friends, we were GAA kids from an early age. And some of the ones that I grew up with were very staunchly Republican, great Republican history in their families going back to, 1916, etc. So those would have been Republican influences for me, some of the friends that I had. But I grew up, my parents were pretty religious, and it was a very Catholic household. And we were brought up through education in the different colleges. I ended up, when I was about 16, going off to a seminary in North Wales to study for the priesthood with the Divine Word missionaries. And it was during this period that I was away that civil rights campaigns had started here in the North, taking a lesson from Martin Luther King and the civil rights campaigns in America. So in terms of my influences, the influences that came on me in terms of republicanism, they didn't really come into vogue or come into play, I suppose, until the pogroms of 1969, when the civil rights marchers were battened off the streets, attacked by state forces of RUC, Beast Specials and loyalist hordes. Totally and absolutely, and everybody's very familiar with the siege at Derry and the Bogside, and all the violence and brutality that occurred there by state forces, and how the people resisted. And in Belfast, similarly, people resisted against the attacks. So what happened was, and I actually was home on holiday from college on leave for the summer holiday in '69 when the pogroms happened in Belfast and North Belfast, as well as everybody's heard about Bombay Street and how the place was decimated and people killed, and RUC, Beast Specials, loyalist gunmen attacking the Catholic area down towards the Falls Road. The same thing happened with us, and I happened to be at home on holidays and was in my friend's house, who lived on the very, very front of the Crumlin Road. And we were attacked by, literally, there must have been a couple of thousand between state forces of the RUC and the Beast Specials and loyalist hordes, just attacked our down. And countless dozens of people were injured by gunfire. 2 were killed. And so many houses, 2 or 3 streets, Brookfield Street, Hooker Street, corner of Herbert Street, front of the Crumlin Road, all burnt down on these attacks. And for me, I would say, people talk about baptisms of fire. Literally, that to me was a baptism of fire, because in a sense, I was actually on the front of the road trying to help my friends and their family to get out, and we got caught right bang smack in the front of the attacks, and we were very lucky to get out. 3 or 4 of us get out of it around a side street and up out of the way without being injured. So for me, that was a bit of a, as I said, a baptism of fire. I was due back in college in September, and I did go back. And for me, I don't think I could settle just as well as I had been during the previous year. I was regarded as a pretty decent student. I was good academically, and everything was working well. But the second year in the seminary, I didn't settle. I was focusing back on the situation here. And when I came home towards the summer of 1970, I had decided that I wasn't going back again. I would say that's maybe a variety of reasons, but I think that, the traumatic effects or events of 1969 in our area would probably a major impact in me making the decision to come home.
Now, that story is just throwing me for a loop. I had not heard that one before. You are arrested in '76, and I'm going to get some of this incorrect, and I apologize. And I'd ask you to clean it up for me. You're arrested in '76. The political status is revoked in '78. And at that time, you joined the No Wash protests in the H blocks. Is that about right?
Yeah, just 1 or 2 years off the mark there, Jay.
Okay.
I was arrested in '75. Political status was revoked, was taken away from political prisoners. It had been granted after a hunger strike in 1972 and negotiations with senior Republicans with the British government in London. They had introduced political status. They termed it as special category status, but the subtext in the legislation refers to it or defines it as, people convicted of offences related to a political nature. So, for want of a better term, it was political status.
Sure.
The British took it away again in March 1976 because political status with the internees, people who were arrested without charge, without court, and interned without trial, were held there between 1971 and Christmas 1975, with no recourse to any appeal or judicial process. You wouldn't have anything like that in America. And what happened also was they introduced in 1973/74 period a diplock court system under Lord Diplock, where they did away with juries. So there was no juries, and again, you wouldn't have anything like that in the States. The 12 jurors. So they did away with that in order to get more convictions, and following on that, in order to undermine the Republican struggle for freedom in Ireland and the whole campaign in the North, they took away political status because they felt that if they criminalized the struggle would have less support. And they felt that the easiest and the best way they could do that were to criminalize IRA prisoners by removing political status. So they introduced this whole criminalization process, which started, I suppose, on March the 1st. Anyone arrested on March the 1st or after March the 1st was no longer afforded political status. They were put into these new-made H blocks, single-story blocks, to isolate prisoners. They had special interrogation and torture centres. They had special diplock court, single-judge court system that would guarantee the British state, more convictions and less chance of claims of brutality standing up in court, because the judge would favour, special branch interrogators or police interrogators before they would favour someone who was injured in the court. So what happened then was numbers increased, but in terms of this conveyor belt system, the final part of it was the H blocks, in order to isolate and for you then to take on the tag of criminality and to depoliticize the struggle. And they felt that was probably the best way to do it. And the difficulty was that we were aware of this. It was a major part in British strategy, and we were singularly aware of the impact that this would have if you accepted a criminal tag. You know, you would lose support base quite rapidly. You would undermine morale of people. So when they introduced this into the H blocks in 1976, the first prisoner convicted to run up against this criminal regime was Kieran Nugent, and he refused to wear the criminal uniform, because prior to that, Republican prisoners or political prisoners would have their own clothing, have their own command structure in the prison. They would organize their own day, you know, outside of security, obviously. They would organize their own education, recreation, sports, etc., etc. All this was removed, and he was placed in a single H block cell measuring about 9 feet by 10 feet, concrete bars and steel bars on the window, steel door, just a concrete, it was like a concrete tomb with no facilities except for his bed, his chamber pot, and a Bible. They always left a Bible. The Good News Bible was always left in, and that was it. So he started this protest, and it meant that you didn't get any visits, you had no contact, you had no letters, you had no contact with the outside world, and for a considerable number of months he was isolated. And then as other prisoners came in, they too were isolated. So we, at that stage, I had been granted political status, and I was over in cage 11 at the time. And these are a compound system, and for anybody who has ever watched any of the World War II prisoner of war camp films like Steve McQueen, you know, The Great Escape, they are a carbon copy, exactly the same. They have 3 Nissen huts, and they have a porta-cabin type situation for showers and toilets, etc. And then it's a caged fence with watchtowers around it, armed guards on the walls, and guards patrolling all the time. It's very, very similar to the World War II POW camps. And it was POW camp. But across the wall, these H blocks. So we were getting information from a variety of sources of the brutality that was happening, and the pressure. And we managed to persuade people like Kieran Nugent, like, just put on the uniform, go and take a visit, and let's have contact. And that's where it built up. But the brutality that was meted out by the prison guards was ferocious, absolutely ferocious. They tried to batter, and these were all young prisoners, by the way, at the start coming in. You know, you're talking about
that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was gonna, in my head, like, you're all in your 20s. Like, nobody is a. I don't want to make it sound inappropriate, but nobody is an adult in the sense of nobody is old. Like, these are all young men. Like, these are all very young men. Talk to us about what was going on and the climate of the prison, and just kind of what prison life was like for these men.
Yeah. Well, prison life in the H blocks was like no other prison anywhere in the world, because the lads, the Republican prisoners, the IRA prisoners who were on protest against the removal of political status, were stripped naked and put in cells, totally naked. So what they had to do then, and they were locked up 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The only opportunity to remove yourself from the cell at the early stages was to go to the toilet, or on a Sunday to put on a pair of the prison trousers and go to a large canteen area where the priest would come in and say mass on a Sunday morning. So we managed to do that. Now, at that stage, as you say, that, you know, very, very young, and particularly a lot of the lads from Derry were late teens, mid to late teens, and there was a considerable number of them, you know, very, very young in their late teens. When I went into prison, I was 23, and I was considered, you know, sort of, you know, more of a more mature age than most of the ones who were in. And there were a lot like older than me, but there were very, very, very few people heading over the 30-year-old mark. Very, very few. Mostly late teens up to early mid 20s, and that was that made up your population of the H block prisoners. It was a very, very harsh regime. As I said, you had no facilities whatsoever, although you were supposed to be able to write a letter per month. This was in the legislation. If you did not comply with regulations and abide by the prison rules, i.e., put on the criminal uniform, accept that you're no longer a political prisoner, and forget about your politics, forget about your struggle. This was what they wanted, and we couldn't do that. And Kieran Nugent, as I said, was the first person to challenge this, and he was met with the full force of the regime. It was systematic brutality, systematic torture of prisoners to get them to conform to the criminal regime. And as the numbers built up, they found a bit of solidarity with other prisoners coming in, and they would keep them isolated in different blocks. And as I say, totally naked. The only thing you could do was wrap around a towel around you or wrap a blanket around you. Hence, the term came to fruition of the blanket men who wore the blanket. And what we did was you would take a blanket and maybe wrap one around you, particularly in the winter where just wearing a towel was not great. And you would cut a slit in the blanket and put it over like Clint Eastwood, like a poncho. So that's the way generally everybody did something like that to keep warm. But that's all you
had. Can you talk for just a moment about what kind of a man Bobby Sands was, and when you think about him now, what comes to mind?
Yeah. First of all, Jay, in terms of me arriving in the H blocks, I actually had political status from 1976 or from 75 when I came in, right through until March, April 78. And the only reason that I ended up in the H blocks was continuously trying to escape with two other comrades, Larry Marley and Pat McGill, both of whom are now dead, right? But we were trying to escape continuously from the cages. We were digging tunnels, cutting fences, people climbing walls, doing all sorts of things. But we got caught on an escape. In fact, just a wee thing about Bobby Sands. While I was in cage 11, Jerry Adams was in cage 11 at the time, and Bobby Sands had been there. He had just been released a couple of months before I arrived into cage 11. But when I got into the education of ourselves, the self-education, I discovered reams of material, and I asked a comrade who was also doing the education brief in the cages, you know, who owns all this? Oh, he says, Bobby Sands wrote all that. And I lifted it and looked through it, and it was this pages after pages about analysis on community involvement in politics, the development of community infrastructure in areas outside the prison, development of community politics, of tenants associations, of rights for people in these areas that were areas in conflict, areas in struggle. And this stuff was far in advance of what was happening outside. And he was writing all this and examining all this, and he got released 2 months before I arrived in, and he put in practice in the Twinbrook area where he's from, he put a lot of this into practice of developing, you know, people's sense of awareness of, you know, belonging to society, get up, get involved, be involved in your local council area, be involved with your local trade unions, all the different types of things. He got people involved in it. But and what I'm sorry about is that none of those documents survived. None of those survived. They all disappeared, you know. And that was, he was writing these in 1974, 75, you know, ages before a lot of this stuff was put into practice. Anyway, that's just a wee aside from the cages point of view of him. So I actually missed him in the cages. But because we were consistently trying to escape, we tried to escape on 31st of March, 1978. Dressed as prison guards, and we managed to get ourselves right down to the exit area, which is called it's the main security area called the tally lodge, where you have to check in your tally, check in your ID before you go out. And to fast forward, we got caught there, transferred to an isolation block, which is called the boards, because you slept on a board, not in a bed. And we were there for about 10, 11 days. And instead of bringing us back, which is normally what they do, they prefer charges against you so that you appear in court. They bring you back to where you escaped from, and then 8 or 9 months later, they bring you out to court. They didn't do that. They came in and read out a piece of paper, saying a document from the British Northern Ireland office, and said that because we had been trying to escape from lawful custody, we were now being transferred to the H blocks. So we were transferred immediately to H block 3, and that's how I ended up in the H blocks. And it was a bit of a jolt, let me tell you, because although we were thinking about it, looking at it, we were writing stuff about it. Jerry Adams was writing all sorts of articles and things, and I'd have been typing these articles up for him. We were studying the criminalisation policy. So we were aware of the British policy of criminalisation upside down. We knew everything aspect of it, but it's only when you get parachuted into the middle of it and you're standing in the middle of a H block with 20 prison guards and you're standing naked and you know that you're vulnerable, and you are then told, that's your cell down Seaway, let's go, away you go. So that was it, and that was my introduction to H blocks, right in the middle of a protest period. Bobby Sands at that stage was actually in H block 5, and we were put into H block 3. Now, the protest had escalated to a no wash protest, and that happened because at the time when some of the lads were going out to use the toilets or get a wash or get a shower, on many occasions prison guards were beating them up, attacking them, brutalizing them, humiliating them, until it got to the stage where the lads had decided, this is just prior to me coming down, that they would wash in the cells. So the guards would put a basin of water in, but then slowly but surely, when they came into the cell, they would kick the basin of water over, kick the chamber pot over, and it became just an absolute mess. Your mattress, which was on the floor, a sponge mattress, was getting soaked, and so they introduced the no wash protest just prior to around about Easter time, 1978, and I landed right into the middle of this, which was a bit of a shock, and it actually took, I don't mind admitting, it took me quite a number of weeks, a couple of weeks at least, to acclimatise myself to this here, to get used to it. First and foremost, that I didn't have any clothing. I was naked. I was locked in a cell, small concrete box, 24/7. I was not going to be able to escape from that. I was not going to get involved in my music or my education or my sports, etc. Everything. I was not going to be able to have visits. All this was prohibited. And it took me a little while to mentally get attuned to that there, and then you move along with the protest, which was a brutal, harsh regime. Let me tell you, brutality was meted out regularly, particularly when there were shifts from making a shift of a full wing of prisoners to a cleaner wing. The brutality would be pretty severe. You would be beaten across the circle area or across the wing area.
Wow. When did you become the OC then, during this time period?
Yeah, and we need to sort of move forward a wee bit, because the deterioration of the conditions was absolutely horrendous. Cardinal O'Fee had come in during the latter part of 1978, and he was taken aback. He was physically sick, visiting cells in the H blocks, physically sick. And when he went out, he made this telling statement, comparing it to some slum dwellings in Calcutta that he had seen when he was out on the missions, missionary work, and said he'd never witnessed anything like it, and made a very, very critical statement of the British in terms of, sort the thing out, introduce measures. He was very, very helpful to the prisoners, very supportive of the prisoners, I have to say that there. And while a lot of others weren't, he was singularly very, very good in terms of trying to alleviate the hardships of the situation. When that moved on, the situation had deteriorated severely. Prisoners were beaten regularly. A number of prisoners were taken in for into the psychiatric unit up in the H blocks. There was a wing, a hospital wing, and were put into a hospital. They were under psychiatric treatment, and but it was severe, and we needed to move out of the situation. A number of us from different blocks in January 1979 were transferred to one wing in H block 6. There were 33 prisoners put into H block And that's the first time that I physically came in contact with Bobby Sands.
Oh, okay.
That was my first physical meeting of him. I had known about him, and I'd read about him, and read his stuff in the cages. I'd heard about him. He was on what we had as, and it's a military sort of regime that we run, and he was on our camp staff in the H blocks, and he was one of the senior people. So when we met in H block 6, we talked and we met, and then we got involved in discussions about how we would move forward. And then it's from that period that I became more closely involved with him and others in H block 6 to try and get things moved forward. Different suggestions, different ideas. How do you increase a protest that is a no wash protest, that is brutal, that is a harsh regime? How do you do anything like that? And he struck me. He had a very poetic mind. He was very analytical. He had politics analysed to a fault. He knew what PR was, and he was encouraging people to write out to personalities, celebrities, politicians, academics, trying to highlight the plight of the protesting prisoners in the H blocks. And we had discussed in 1979 the potential for hunger strike, because that seemed to be the only way that we were going to get out of the situation and try and bring this nightmare to an end. So when we talked about it and we broached the idea, there was Father Alec Reid, whom you may be aware of, who was one of the chaplains that came in and out, a great man, absolute great man altogether. And he would liaise with the Catholic hierarchy in terms of what was happening. And we had discussed with our leadership outside the potential for hunger strike. They were dead set against it. But when we discussed it, we were talking in the middle of 1979, and we were talking of a target date, of August, September. And then Cardinal O'Fee sent word and said, look, there's a papal visit coming to Ireland for the first time in October of 1979, and for a hunger strike to be ongoing, with people possibly reaching a crisis point while the papal visit was taking place, would be an absolute disaster for the church in Ireland, be a disaster for the papal visit. It would detract from the goodness of what they expected coming out of a papal visit. So he had asked us to defer any decisions relating to hunger strike until after the papal visit. And in the meantime, that himself and Bishop Edward Daly from Derry would use their good offices to lobby Maggie Thatcher's government in terms of introducing, a dialogue, or at least measures that would alleviate the situation in the H block, an attempt to get out of the dire situation. So we agreed, and we moved on in that situation. So Cardinal O'Fee, but he actually, from we agreed to do that, it was almost 8 months that he was lobbying Thatcher and her government to try and get some, even menial reforms introduced to alleviate the situation. And quite frankly, her and her colleagues in the Conservative government led the Cardinal and Bishop Daly a merry dance all around the place, even to the extent when pressure became on them, they introduced this measure of prisoners may now have their own civilian clothing. And Cardinal O'Fee welcomed this as a major step. We also would have welcomed this as a major step if they were giving us our own clothing, which was part and parcel of the 5 demands that we had put out for ourselves and our women colleagues in our women prisoners in Armagh Women's Prison. We had put out the H Block Armagh Committee and put out a series of documents, but one of the key things was the 5 demands. Number 1 on it was prisoners should be allowed to wear their own clothes. So Cardinal O'Fee greeted this greatly and then travelled home from Rome. He was out at a seminar in Rome and travelled home to welcome this, only to be told that Mrs. Thatcher did not say they could have their own civilian clothes. She said and she told the Cardinal this, no, we have told the prisoners they can have clothing of a civilian type nature, which is not their own civilian clothing.
Yeah.
And they brought these in. O'Fee felt betrayed by this here, and felt that this was a major slapdown. And this was the camel. This was the straw that broke a camel's back as far as we were concerned, because we knew that they were just playing about. There's a great shot in a film called Hunger, where Michael Fassbender plays Bobby Sands.
Yeah.
And it's the part where they introduce the prison type civilian clothing, and the prison guards are laughing as it's being introduced, and you see the upsurge in the Bobby Sands character until he just explodes and wrecks up the furniture. You know, it's a great telling point to demonstrate, you know, how crazy that sort of situation was. But that's the one that broke the situation, and then we went into hunger strike mode.
There's a story about you becoming the OC at this time. Can you talk about that? Can you share that experience with us?
Yeah, just briefly to introduce that aspect of it. I, at that period in time, was a PRO. I wrote letters. I encouraged other people to write letters and contact.
PRO stands for Public Relations.
Yeah, PRO officer, public relations officer. That's what it was. PR person, and we had smuggled in little pens, Parker refill pens, and cigarette papers, you know, the roll-up cigarettes. We joined those. So we wrote our letters and stretch and seal, smuggled them out. But anyway, that's another story. So I was the PR person during the period that would have been the first hunger strike. Bobby Sands had taken over from Brendan Hughes at the time, so he was in the, what you would say, the key position as OC in the H blocks. And we ran through that first hunger strike with massive support all over the place. And I have to pay compliment to our friends and colleagues in America who came out in their thousands everywhere all over America, from the very start of the protest, the whole way through, for the entire from the withdrawal of political status, the whole way through, years of lobbying, you know, embassies and consulates all over America, tremendous support, which was crucial in building up the pressure on the British. So we took ourselves through that hunger strike. It ended with a promise of negotiations on a document that the British produced that was being, we knew and had heard there was background contact, and that there was some negotiations going on behind the scenes, and messages were being relayed to us on a promise of a document being produced that the prisoners could favourably read, that would allow the situation to develop into a positive way out of the situation for all concerned. And prior to that document arriving, it actually arrived with a priest, one of the Redemptorist priests, who was a colleague of Father Reid. But at the time that the document presentation and all was happening, and all this was going on, people were told this is in the mix. Sean McKenna, one of the hunger strikers, had gone into a coma, had been transferred from the H Block Prison Hospital to the Musgrave Park Military Hospital outside in Belfast, and he had lapsed into a coma. So the lads in the hospital felt that things probably could get resolved, and there's no point in Sean McKenna dying. They felt that this was a possibility, that there's no point. So they terminated the hunger strike and sent word to Musgrave Hospital that Sean McKenna should receive treatment, and that then fast forwarded things. But the British did not produce the document. They did not live by the spirit of the document. They did not adhere to it. They did not introduce new measures. They decided that without the leverage of pressure of the hunger strike continuing, that they didn't have to worry, and that they decided to use the opportunity to hammer us into the ground. And I distinctly recall, because our people had brought up the parcels, brought up our clothes, all of it was turned away, and this would have been part and parcel of resolution of the situation. All of it was turned away. So post the Christmas period, with confusion reigning, Bobby Sands was negotiating with the senior governor, which would be in American terms a warden, the warden. The senior governor of the time was Governor Hilditch, and he was negotiating with him in terms of, look, our lads can come out of the cells, we can clean up, we can pay it, because we'd never refused to maintain the buildings we lived in, in terms of cleaning and looking after, maintaining the food we would look after, all that sort of stuff. And that it ended up towards the end of January that the senior governor called him out and told him, Sands, this is it. Unless your men put on that criminal uniform, come out of the cells, get cleaned, and abide by the rules and regulations and the orders of my prison guards instead of your own staff, you'll not be going anywhere. And that was the breaker that threw us into the second hunger strike. Now, what happened on the basis of that was that Bobby Sands himself, now we had a fierce argument with the leadership outside the prison for this hunger strikes. They were totally and absolutely opposed to hunger strike action, because I think and I feel that they believed on two counts: you're going to lose lives on a hunger strike, and secondly, you're propelling prisoners to the forefront of struggle, which means the integrity, credibility of the struggle is resting upon the shoulders of people who are in prison. This should never be the case. And what was at stake was massive. And a thing that I always point out to people is that many people have asked me that, how come this protest lasted 5 years? How come there was a hunger strike that cost lives on the streets? How come this was over a prison protest? And the answer is, generally in prison protests, somebody gets up and throws slates off a roof, or they set fire to the mattresses on a wing. 2 or 3 days later, there's negotiations, and okay, you'll get an extra such and such, or there'll be an extra time for this, and then within a week, it's all gone.
Yeah.
What is crucial about this is because the British chose the H-blocks and the prisoners as the vulnerable underbelly, the soft underbelly of Republican struggle, that by defeating Republican prisoners and criminalizing Republican prisoners, by extension, they could defeat the Republican struggle and defeat the IRA. And this is what it's all about. So the political ramifications of success or failure were massive to both the British and to ourselves. And that's why it went to such a degree, to such a high politically charged level. And that's why hunger strike was considered as the final option, because we had nowhere else to go. The IRA were totally opposed to it, and we argued with them. And the only reason in the end up that they acceded to our course of action was that when we said to them, okay, no hunger strike, provide us with the alternative. Tell us the alternative, because as far as we can see, surrender to criminalization is the only option that's in here, and we are not prepared to take that. But if you can provide us from outside with an alternative to hunger strike, certainly we'll go that way. They were not able to do that, and that's why the hunger strikes took place. And at the end of January, Bobby Sands had been on a visit. Danny Morrison, who was the PR person for Sinn Féin at the time, had come up, and he was our press officer, and he'd come up on a visit. Bobby came back from the visit and said, this is before he even, considered talking to me about it. He says, Danny was up on a visit there, and this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. The second hunger strike, we've told them the manner in which it's going to take place. And I told him that you're taking over as OC after me. And I said, what? And he says, well, you're going to be taking over as OC. I says, you never asked me. This didn't come into conversation. No, he says, that's what I want you to, in that position. I says, I don't want to do that. I really did not want that burden of responsibility on me. I just felt that I wasn't equipped for that, even though I'd been through all this protest. I had a pretty good idea of the whole politics of the situation, and my credentials were decent. They were okay. I did not want the responsibility of that weighing upon my shoulders, because I know the pressure that he was under during the first hunger strike, because I was there in the background supporting him. And he says, no, I'm not having it any other way. So I then argued with him that, we have a command structure in the prison like anybody else. And you have your OC, your officer commanding. and then you have your vice OC, your second, then you have your adjutant, your education, etc., etc., etc. You have a load of people. And in terms of your PR person, I was at the bottom of the packing order. So I said to him, I'm away down the lane. I said, for example, I says, the vice OC, second in command is Shanna Walsh over in his Block 5. I says, that is rightfully his position. He's got the politics. He's been in with you before. He's been in the cages. He knows this business upside down and inside out, and he's nobody's fool. He understands perfectly exactly what's required here. And Bobby Sands said to me, well, you're leaving one thing out. You're forgetting one thing. And I said, what's that? He says, that's my best mate. I says, what's that got to do with it? He says, well, the situation is this. He says, see, the hunger strike starts and we get to a crisis situation or a critical period, and there has to be negotiations. And he says, and I'm on hunger strike and I'm not physically capable of conducting the negotiations. He says, and someone who is doing it will have to say to the British, that's not good enough. He says, he'll not let me die. And I said, what do you mean? He says, he'll not let me die. And I said, and what you're saying is that I will let you die? He says, yes, you have to. And that's it. You just have to be in the position to say, no, this is not what Bobby Sands and these hunger strikers are here for. You have to be in that position. If hunger strikers are not capable in a situation. Now, I just felt totally taken aback by that. So I actually said to him, so that's your your view towards me. That's the attitude you think about me, this hardened, non-emotional person. So it was a wee bit rough to take, but
you're like what, 28,
24, 25, 1978, or sorry, 1981. 29, yeah.
Like, I mean, that is an incredible burden is the only word that I can think of right now. And I don't mean it because it sounds so negative, but like that is an incredible responsibility to put on someone, let alone someone, at 30 years of age, roughly. That's
when he said that to me, I just says, well, if that's the way you feel about it, then okay. He made me an offer I couldn't refuse. To say no to that, you couldn't say no to that because his confidence in me was immeasurable. I just couldn't believe it that he had that level of confidence. Yes, I know, you know all about this. I want you there. I want you. I don't want anybody else because I want to know who I'm dealing with. And he knew the person that was me, and he knew that intimately over the previous couple of years.
But as the hunger strike starts and then progressive, you're in a unique position as the OC because you are allowed to visit the hunger strikers, and it's a unique position because you have to be the support, but you also have to be the leader itself, and that's different than what anyone else would have gone through at that time. What do you remember most about visiting the hunger strikers and kind of visiting with their families and kind of, having to kind of move around during that time period?
Well, I will say this, 1981 was possibly the worst year of my life. I can say that, right, without fail, because we were in this situation and I was placed into a position of responsibility that I did not want to be in. And the fact that the strategy for the hunger strike was not just a group of people going on hunger strike. This was a staggered, phased hunger strike where Bobby Sands would go first, followed in 2 weeks by Francis Hughes, followed 2 weeks later by Ray McCreesh and Patsy O'Hara. Then a strategy that if a hunger striker died, or when a hunger striker died, he would be replaced by another hunger striker. So this was calculated, it was clinical. People have said that we were extremely clinically focused and hard in the manner in which we rolled out the strategy of this hunger strike. And even opponents would say that this was very, very, this was clear cut. These people mean business. And this was clearly to demonstrate to the British that irrespective of what happens here, this is not going to end. until we get to a final settlement and solution. Now, it was difficult. You know, there was tremendous support during the hunger strike from the early days right through. Bobby Sands was in the wing with us up until his 22nd or 23rd day on hunger strike, or 21st day on hunger strike, where he was moved to the prison hospital. He was in a cell by himself. We had Philip Rooney next door, another prisoner, was allowed to go in and clean out his cell each day. And Philip then would be able to smuggle little bits and pieces of communications, small comms on the cigarette paper, in and out, and just tend to him and be a friendly face in and out of his cell. Then he moved to the prison hospital. During the course of his time in the prison hospital, there were a considerable number of what would be termed as interventions, which be some of them visitations by politicians. The Pope sent an emissary, a bishop who was originally from Newry in the north. Southern politicians, Irish politicians, trade union people, English politicians. People had come in. The Irish Commission for Justice and Peace had come in during the course of the hunger strikes. The International Red Cross had come in. This is all during the entire run of the hunger strike period. But the European Commission for Human Rights sent a delegation about just over a week to 10 days before Bobby Sands died. And I was sent for. I think it was a Sunday morning. I was sent for, and I was brought to the prison hospital. And this was the first time that I was brought up. And we felt that with me being asked to go to the prison hospital, with the European commissioners being in, and with Bobby Sands, 56 plus days on hunger strike, we didn't know how long it was going to last, that there was a potential here for movement. Maybe the British are going to open a door here, we can put a foot in. So I went to the prison hospital, and but part and parcel of the proviso that we had laid down from Bobby Sands and the hunger strikers was that in the event of any negotiations for a settlement, that we asked for 2 external advisors, and we named Gerry Adams and Danny Morrison. Gerry Adams was in Belfast at the time, and Danny Morrison, who was our press officer. We asked for those 2 as assistants to come in for any negotiations, and the British refused. And when I got to the prison hospital, I wasn't aware that this refusal had taken place. I thought things possibly moving. So I met with the European commissioners. I think there were 4 in all. Well, 2 commissioners and 2 assistants. And I spoke to them, and they told me they were there. They needed a visit with Bobby Sands, that they could have a chat with him and see what way things were. But he was refusing to speak to them unless, first of all, that I was there and that Gerry Adams and Danny Morrison were there. And I says, yeah, that's what we've laid down in terms of assistance in terms of negotiations. And he says, well, the British are saying that Gerry Adams and Danny Morrison are persona non grata, that they would not be allowed into the prison. And I says, well, look, all you need to do is phone them and tell them you can see Bobby Sands in 2 seconds, 2 minutes here, if they bring those 2 up. And they says, well, we've already asked, and they've said under no circumstances whatsoever are those 2 getting into the prison. And that's when I knew that the British did not mean to, bring in these people as a way out of the situation. They were, it was actually they were introduced as a request from the Irish government at the time, which was a way out of getting pressure off the Irish government at the time, who were feeling and putting pressure on the British. They sort of persuaded Bobby Sands' family to allow the commissioners in that they could help to alleviate it, which wasn't the case, because it takes 4 or 5 years for a case to run through Europe. But anyway, so I then said, well, can I speak with Bobby Sands? And they checked with the British Secretary of State's office at the Northern Ireland office, and they come back and said, yeah, he can go. So I went down to the cell that he was in, and it's in the prison hospital. It's a cell structure. It's a lot more comfortable than a prison cell, but it's still a cell. And the door was wide open. There was a medic a medical guard in whites at the doorway. And as I walked down and walked in, the medic, whom I remember, was speaking in hushed tones. And to me, it was as if to speak loudly would be a disturbance to the comfort of Bobby Sands lying in the bed. At the same time, now Francis Hughes was a few cells down, as was Raymond McCreesh and Patsy O'Hara. They were in cells further on down the wing. I didn't get to see them. I only got to see Bobby Sands. But when I walked in, he was propped up on a number of pillows, and his eyes were very sunken in his head. His cheekbones were sunken. He didn't recognize me until I moved close to the actual bottom of the bed and walked around the side of the bed. There was a small bedside cabinet with a radio on it and a jug of water. And as I moved closer, he spoke. His voice was very labored. You know, it was hard for him to speak. And when I told him it was me, oh, all right, Cara, all right. So I pulled a seat up and sat by the bedside. Prison guard pulled a chair up. The medic pulled a chair and sat in the doorway. So we began talking, and he was in an absolutely dreadful state. You know, I mean, he'd lost all his weight. He looked dreadful, just looked absolutely horrendous. And I was sort of taken aback because this is the first occasion that I've seen a hunger striker at this stage of a hunger strike. Any of the other ones was during the course of, prior to that, there he was on the wing with us, you know, so you only see him the first week or two. And this was him at a very advanced stage. And he was weak. His breathing was labored. His voice was weak. He found it very difficult to focus. His sight was you know, hard to see, and hearing was impaired a little bit. He couldn't hear very well, so that's why I had to go close. So he asked me why I was there. I explained about the European commissioners that were down in the governor's office, and he says to me, "What about the big lad?" Whom he always referred to, Gerry Adams, as the big lad. He says, "What about the big lad and Danny?" And I says, "Well, I've asked them about that, and they've said that the Brits have refused to allow them in." And at that moment, he knew that the negotiations were not going anywhere, and that the British were not genuine about an intention of bringing an end to this hunger strike. And it was at that point that he realised. And I knew as well, we both knew that this visit with him and me would be the last time that I would see him. I just assumed it. He knew it as well. But he went on to talk about the comrades on the wings and tell the lads, you know, send them my best regards, tell them, stay strong, keep at it. And the women, he had this passion for the women comrades in Armagh that he used to keep in contact with regularly. He'd wrote poetry about them and for them. And he had asked about sending word to Armagh. And I had said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. And they're all doing well and they're supporting you and we're in regular contact. And I don't think I was in that cell 15 minutes. I don't think I was there 15 minutes. It was very, very hard to sit there. And at the end of it, he just, he said to me, I said, look, I'll go on and leave you in peace. And he says, yeah, okay. So what are you going to do? I says, I'm going to go back to these commissioners and tell them unless Gerry Adams arrives up to prison, there'll be no, you know, the British refuse him in, then we believe the British are not genuine in making a resolution. So there's no point in staying. And as I got up to go, he just grabbed my hand. He says, I'm dying, Cara, I'm dying. And that's the last that he spoke to me. And I left, back to the commissioners, and then went back to the H block that it was in, the wing that it was in.
Big, I can't. I mean, that you've literally taken my breath away, and I'm sorry. I'm needing just a moment to kind of compose myself here. But when you think about the hunger strikes, what is one thing that you want people to know more and to understand, more so than just the stuff that uh, is more on the surface or whatnot? Like, what's something that you would really want people to take to heart when they think about the hunger strikes when we move into March and through the summer and whatnot?
Well, I mean, this is 40 years ago. And quite frankly, I never believed that I'd seen this age and this conflict that we were in. And to me, like 40 years on from hunger strike, and it still has that impact. It still has that focus, that meaning. It's almost continuation and struggle. This hunger strike is a living memory. It lives today. There are so many young people today are eager to find out about the hunger strike and what happened and why did so many people die on hunger strike? What were the politics of it? Who were the people on hunger strike? What were they like? Where did they come from? How old were they? Joe McDonnell, I think, was 29, got on 30 on the hunger strike, who would have been the eldest, and the youngest was about 20 or 21. So they were all guys from rural areas, city areas. All of them were your ordinary from working class backgrounds, grew up. Some had college education, some most didn't. Some of them are rough, hardy lads from their areas, country lads working in farming areas. But the one thing that united them all in the fact that they were ordinary lads involved in struggle. They, under severe circumstances and absolute extraordinary conditions, they rose out of an ordinariness to display extraordinary strength and commitment and determination, and a massive feat of strength to carry them through a conviction that they were right, that their politics were right, that their struggle was right, that they were not going to fail. They were not going to allow themselves to be used to undermine our struggle. And they were totally and absolutely focused on that. And that is evident by the fact that they had gone through an arduous, grueling, terrible period on hunger strike, all the way through up to the longest, I think, was 70, 71 days, 72 days on hunger strike. And, an agonizing period and an agonizing time for their families, for their parents, for their wives, their children, their brothers or sisters. And to me, that is another aspect of it that for me, I didn't have anybody. I wasn't in that situation. I just cannot get to grips with that type of strength and that type of commitment that drives them forward through that awful period. I think that they're a beacon as an example for people in struggle anywhere, that people can take example from that sacrifice or that determination. And I know that throughout the world in different struggles. I remember Benazir Bhutto, Pakistan, actually quoting that when she had been incarcerated, that she took strength from Bobby Sands and people like him that give her the strength to endure prison conditions. So the impact that they had on people around the world, not just locally, was massive. So there are lots of people today, there are young people today who tell me that some of their inspiration, some of the inspiration today comes from the hunger strikers. Some of their involvement in struggle, part and parcel of a big part of their involvement in struggle comes from the example of the hunger strikers. But there's the lessons that are there to be learned are when you're in struggle, you're at death's door, you're in dire situations in a concrete box 10 feet by 9 feet, there's always hope. And the hunger strikers provided that. They provided that hope. They provided that example. And they provided that leadership, considering that hunger strikers and prisoners were propelled, not willingly, to the forefront of this struggle and led from the front and made sure that they did not, through their actions, create any difficulties for this struggle. And out of it was born a movement, I have always said that the hunger strikes were, the platform upon which the development and enhancement of Republican politics has continued to this day. Out of that has come the type of struggle that we've been involved in the whole way down the years to the stage that we're at this time. And many people who are talking about hunger strikers will tell you that as far as they're concerned, this was the watershed moment. These are the men who died in the hunger strike, and the women who were in Armagh prison as well, who provided the leadership. People have compared them to the momentous occasion of the GPO in 1916. This is our watershed. 1981 was our watershed, and we owe an absolutely massive debt of gratitude to 10 absolutely courageous and selfless people who put their lives in the line that this struggle could continue.
Well, I want to thank you a lot. It's meant a lot to me to have you come on, Bik. I can't express to you how much it has meant to me to have this conversation. Before I let you go, and I know that time is short, so I will ask you to briefly give me an answer. I ask everybody this. I'm an avid reader, and I would wonder if you were to meet a total stranger on the street and they were to say, I want to know more, and just what do you recommend them to read? What book, website, podcast, what would you tell a total stranger to do to learn more and to educate themselves a little bit?
Yes, Jay, in terms of acquiring historical aspects or knowledge of the hunger strike period, there are a number of ways you can do it. I mean, I also belong, along with Jerry Adams and Danny Morrison, whom I've mentioned,
Sure.
And former OC of the prison, Sheila Dara, of the Armagh Women's Prison. We belong to the Bobby Sands Trust, and that's a website. You just key in Bobby Sands Trust, you get all the information in terms of hunger strike material there. But recommended reading, there are a host of books that were written about the hunger strikes. Some of them are not worth reading. Some of them are okay. Some of them are decent. But for me, there are two or three key aspects. One is written by David Beresford, who was the South Africa correspondent for the Guardian newspaper in the 1980s. And he wrote a book called 10 Men Dead, where he took all the communications that we had smuggled out, were kept. He was given access to all these, so he based his book around that. And for me, it is a formidable account and an accurate account of the hunger strike period, if anybody wanted to read that. Secondly, we wrote a book ourselves in prison prior to release. 10 years or more after the hunger strikes, we wrote a book. Lawrence McKeown, who was a former hunger striker and is involved in theatre and drama and all the rest of it, in writing, along with Brian Campbell, another prisoner who has since died, they compiled a collection of stories, and I think there could be anything between 15 and 20 contributions to this book, and it's called Nor Meekly Serve My Time, and it's individual stories by prisoners and former hunger strikers who contributed to this book. Definitely a worthwhile read. Certainly Bobby Sands' own writings. There are Bobby Sands' writings and collections of his stories, but one particular thing is his diary that he wrote himself, which commenced on March the 1st, and actually he wrote 17 days, and it terminated on St. Patrick's Day. His last entry in the diary was St. Patrick's Day of 1981, and he kept a daily journal of what was happening during his hunger strike, and definitely a worthwhile read. In fact, we are just about to reissue this on March the 1st. It's been reprinted with a new foreword and a couple of introductions by other people, introductions to it. Certainly a worthwhile read. And for people looking, at in terms of the blanket protest and the hunger strikes, the film Hunger, which features Michael Fassbender playing Bobby Sands and Liam Cunningham as the prison chaplain, as one of the prison chaplains, won all sorts of awards at Cannes Film Festival, etc., etc. The British tried to keep it down in England. And it's a film that was made by an absolutely tremendous director. And just to give a wee info on him, he was a young black kid growing up in London at 15 years of age during 1981. He became a Turner Prize winner in latter years for art, and was offered by Channel 4 to produce a documentary of anything he wanted. And he says, I want to do a documentary about Bobby Sands. And they said, are you crazy? And he says, well, if I'm not doing that, I'm not doing anything. They threw the checkbook on the table and told him, write your own check, go ahead. So he made this documentary. And the reason he said he made it was that as a 15-year-old black kid subject to discrimination and abuse in London, two abiding memories of 1981. One was Tottenham Hotspur winning the English FA Cup, of which he was a great fan. And the second was this image of an Irish guy called Bobby Sands on hunger strike. So that's another, the film Hunger. You can actually get it on YouTube. It's certainly that will be worth a watch. But certainly those would be my recommended readings. Short list of them.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us today. I very much appreciate it. I also want to say that we need to have you back at a later date to talk about the rest of your life and other things that you have been involved in. And so I definitely want to make sure that gets put on the books. But Bik, thank you, man. I really do appreciate it. I am borderline, which is a rarity. I am borderline speechless at this point in time. So I just want to say thank you again. And if you need anything, man, please don't hesitate to ever reach out. I think you've got a world of support in the States. I think we'd be happy to do anything we could for you.
Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to share my background, history, and my knowledge of that period. And I really appreciate it. And certainly we will stay in touch.
Thank you. So thank you again for tuning in. I always say this, but I genuinely mean this. You need to share this video. This message needs to get out. We need people to see it. We need people to become active. We need people to become involved. So if you haven't yet, please like this video. Please share it. Please make sure that you send it to that one guy that that would find this fascinating and become a friend of Sinn Féin. It doesn't take very much. It doesn't take a lot of time. Thank you again for tuning in. Until next time, Slán.